Initially, both Looney Tunes' Merry Melodies were merely trying to replicate the success and style of Disney's own Silly Symphonies, but it wouldn't be long until they developed a style of their own that would go on to define Warner Brothers animation. In terms of shorts, they were pretty much kicking Disney's ass during this time, but here's the thing. Disney didn't really have much competition in terms of feature-length animation except for Fleischer Studios, their former biggest rival. Due to the troubled production of these films and the aftermath that ensued, other studios took note of this and played it safe by sticking to shorts. It also didn't help that during this time Disney themselves were struggling to make back their money with the release of films like Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi, but they at least had the drive of Walt and the money made from Snow White to keep them going. And with that, Disney had the market on lock. There would be a couple of films made during this time by other studios, but all of those failed to become hits. But it was not long after this period that Disney too would enter a dark age after the loss of Walt Disney. It was during this time that other animated films would finally begin to do well. The Beatles would release Yellow Submarine, which proved to be a big hit both critically and financially. Ralph Bakshi was making films that were breaking new grounds for theatrical animation in the US. Even Don Bluth had hits that began to outperform his old employer at Disney. Warner, meanwhile, just stuck to repackaging their old shorts in theaters. After the death of Walt Disney, the company stayed in a deep depression that seemed endless, but then their luck changed when they acquired Michael Eisner, and with a few minor alterations, the Disney Renaissance was born. And with this new era for animation, Warner established a new feature animation division, and their first film they decided to distribute was... Moving on, we would eventually get something a little more interesting. While Batman Mask of the Phantasm technically wasn't released under the Warner Bros. Feature animation brand, I think it still deserves an honorary mention for being their first in-house theatrical animated film. What originally started as a direct-to-video movie, Warner early in production decided to release the film in theaters. And with only 8 months to deadline, Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, and their team worked hard to adjust for this new format. Thankfully, Warner granted them a larger budget and pretty much let the team do whatever they wanted. But, thanks to poor promotion, barely anyone went to see the film. Sure, it made back its money after doing well on video, and they didn't even lose that much thanks to its relatively small budget, but how did Warner manage to fuck this up? They had everything going for them here. It's a movie based on a popular TV show that was based on a popular comic book character that, at the time, had a series of popular films already in theaters. So Warner literally had no reason for this to underperform like it did. And it's a shame because in my opinion, not only is it one of the best Batman movies, it's one of the best superhero movies period. With its noir-inspired look and crime drama story, it definitely stood out compared to other animated films at the time, and even now. But at least it has maintained a strong cult following nearly 25 years later. After Batman, Warner distributed 2 other films, Thumbelina and A Troll in Central Park. Meanwhile, Warner was working on something of their own, a film that would come to define a generation and mark the next high point in both cinema and animation. Come on and slam and welcome to Japan, cause it's Space Jam. While the marketing for Mask of the Phantasm was lackluster, Warner did the exact opposite here as they really marketed the hell out of this film. Commercials, merchandise, a big soundtrack that still knocks to this day.
I believe I can fly.
Warner really stepped up their game to make sure that this would be a slam dunk. And it was, as it opened up to #1 at the box office and made a lot of money both here in the US and overseas, as it ended up being the highest grossing non-Disney animated film up to that point. But even so, critics did not like this movie all that much, with some notable exceptions. Special criticism was directed at how blatantly commercial this film was and seemed more concerned with trying to sell a product rather than tell a compelling story.
Get your Hanes on, lace up your Nikes, grab your Wheaties and your Gatorade, we'll pick up a Big Mac on the way to the ballpark.
I'm not saying they're wrong, but the film does have a certain level of self-awareness and irony that some people seem to miss. But I still think its success was deserved and welcomed even. It, along with Toy Story, showed that you didn't need to make a musical to be a hit. It helped the careers of animators like Bruce W. Smith take off, but most importantly, it gave Warner Bros. The confidence to make more animated projects after seeing how profitable it can be. And to this day, it's still finally remembered by a whole generation who saw it as kids. If you take it for what it is, it's a fun time. After scoring big with Space Jam, Warner would soon distribute another animated film from their merger with Turner Entertainment called Cats Don't Dance, but that, like their previous distribution deals, flopped hard. During this time, however, Warner was working on their next animated film, Quest for Camelot. While the marketing for this movie wasn't quite on the level of Space Jam, Warner still gave it some good push. The company really thought this was going to be the next big thing. And the film, to the shock of Warner Brothers, ended up flopping big time. This is what began the downfall of Warner Brothers feature animation. It caused the company to abandon their plans of establishing a full-fledged animation studio like Disney, and instead went back to hiring on a project-by-project basis. And with that, scaling back on the budget of their future projects. In an article from the LA Times, co-chairman of Warner Bros. At the time, Robert Daly, said, "We decided we were not going to compete with Disney. We decided to stick with edgy comedies and more adventurous type movies as opposed to breaking out in song musicals." But the thing is, they wouldn't have had this problem in the first place if they didn't make a 180 and ape Disney style. Poorly, I might add, since even the art style looked muddy and rough compared to the brighter and cleaner look of Disney. Space Jam wasn't a musical, nor was it set in a fairy tale world, and that made a profit far larger than any of Disney's other competitors at the time that were following their formula. So what made them believe doing the same thing as everyone else would be a good idea? Like, come on!
What were they thinking?
But the worst thing about this whole thing is that this was all thanks to executive meddling, constant changes in the story being made, people getting fired left and right, and going over budget. It was a nightmare for the people who worked on it, but at least it is here that Warner Bros. Learned their lesson and stuck with doing their own thing instead. Wanting to move away from the committee-approved style that squandered the potential of Camelot, Brad opted for a more director-driven approach that encouraged creativity and teamwork. He wanted something different from everything else at the time, yet reminiscent of early Disney films. In fact, he made his disdain for modern Disney animated films very clear to anyone who would listen. From the aspect ratio, relatively unknown story, and Cold War setting that's modern enough to be familiar, yet old enough to be timeless, everything was accounted for to match his vision. Warner really did give Brad and his team a lot of creative control, and the results were paying off. Early reception of the movie was immensely positive, far more than any other film Warner had made in years. But unfortunately, Warner realized too late that this movie had potential to be a hit. You see, most big animated movies get a trailer or a poster at least a year before release, but wouldn't be until months before release that this would happen for The Iron Giant, and even then, they did a poor job of selling it to an audience, and as the story goes, the film flopped at the box office. Brad and his team were devastated that the project they put so much time and effort into failed to be a hit, as they had incredibly high hopes for it. Could it have really changed the face of feature animation? What would the world of animation look like today if The Iron Giant had become the blockbuster hit it was destined to be? And one of the biggest what-if stories in animation, it's something that no one for sure can say they know about. But on the upside, the film would have one hell of a shelf life. Nearly 2 decades later, the film is still considered to be one of the greatest animated films of all time, and at this point it's been seen by a lot of people thanks to strong sales on video and reruns on channels like Cartoon Network. It truly is an example of life after death at the box office. And it's definitely one of my favorite films period, and one of my biggest inspirations for wanting to pursue a career in both film and animation. So yeah, box office bomb, but a beloved classic nonetheless. After kicking themselves in the dick multiple times for fucking up with The Iron Giant, I guess Warner thought, hey, maybe we can give this animation thing another chance. After all, their distribution of Pokemon, the first movie later that year, proved to be a big hit and made up for the flop that was their distribution of another movie earlier that year. How do you fucking make less than Doug's first movie? And their solution for failure? That's right, those sons of bitches literally went to themselves, hey, remember that one popular movie we made? Remember how it was a live-action animation hybrid? Remember how Bill Murray was in it? Yeah? Well, let's get him back. Surely we'll have another hit. I'm pretty sure this was an afterthought, however, as original descriptions for the film dating back to 1999 don't even mention anything about it being live action. So I kinda get the feeling that only later in production they decided to add the live action segments to what was originally a fully animated film, but I could be wrong. This is on top of executive meddling to cut out a lot of content that would have given it a PG-13. And surprise, surprise, it flopped due to bad marketing. In an interview with Animation World Network, animation director Piet Kroon acknowledges these advertising issues. He mentions how Warner was already pushing hard for Harry Potter while Osmosis Jones got far less. Which is sad because even though the marketing was bad, it was still better than the one Warner did for The Iron Giant apparently. So Warner clearly learned absolutely nothing and repeated the same mistake. And I'm not gonna lie and say Osmosis Jones was a tragedy on the scale of Iron Giant, but it was still a pretty good movie in my opinion. The jokes are funny.
The chicks line up to divide with me.
Oh, really? Because to me, you look like the kind of cell who mostly divides with himself.
The animation is smooth and stylish, and the villain is one of my favorites from any movie for how slick yet brutal he is. And with the enormous success of Shrek a few months prior, it showed that people would still go see an animated movie not made by Disney, and one that was edgy too. One that had jokes that Disney were not touching at the time. There was clearly a market for raunchier comedies, and I feel with the right marketing, and maybe if they had kept the PG-13 rating, the film could have done pretty well. And it seemed like Warner themselves were expecting it to do well, considering they had prepared a bunch of merchandise for it that ended up going nowhere. But executive meddling, like Quest for Camelot, hurt the final outcome, and bad marketing killed it. It truly was bad marketing that killed the movie star. Wow, that was shit. After this, Warner would distribute the Powerpuff Girls movie, which would also flop pretty badly. Thankfully, at least the budget was a lot lower this time around for that. So the executives of Warner probably took a deep breath and said, alright, let's try this one more time and see if this one is a hit. Sticking to their plan of not trying to compete with Disney, they made another comedy, but this time backpedaling even further. They probably realized, hey, Bill Murray didn't do jack and shit for us, so let's get the Looney Tunes again.
Get the Looney Tunes!
Looney Tunes!
Now, unlike Osmosis Jones, which was another untested property, Looney Tunes was a household name that was a reliable brand. And with Looney Tunes back in action, they at least seemed to want to make a movie that was more faithful to the spirit of the original Looney Tunes. I couldn't find anything on how the film was being marketed to indicate whether it was good or bad, but I was old enough to remember the movie coming out, and I recall seeing commercials and merchandise related to it, so it had to have been pretty good advertising at least. But even with all this, the film ended up being a huge flop. And with it being the camel that broke the straw's dick, it caused Warner Brothers to officially shut down their feature-length animation division. Now, this begs the question of how it did so poorly. It couldn't have been bad marketing, which caused the downfall of most of their other properties. It wasn't the premise, which admittedly might have been what turned some people off from Osmosis Jones. It even had the Looney Tunes, which is a recognizable brand. So, what was it? Honestly, it's hard to say. A common blame, not just for the movie, but for other animated films doing poorly at the time, was the medium shift to 3D animation. CG animated films were still fairly new, and all of them at the time were doing very well. And by 2003, the only 2D animated film to have really done well within the past few years was Lilo and Stitch. DreamWorks that same year shut down their 2D department, and even Disney a year later would do the same. So it makes sense for that being the reason, but I feel like it had to have been something else besides that. Well, whatever the reason may have been, it still did poorly. The irony being how the brand that helped them rise to fame and success would be what ended up causing their demise. And with that, an era of animation closed, as Warner would never again go on to make another animated feature film again. Until the Lego Movie, that is. That's right, 11 years after their last film, Warner Bros. Would once again give it another go, but this time under a new name, Warner Animation Group. And with their first film, the Lego Movie proved to be a huge hit both financially and critically, far surpassing the company's previous big hit Space Jam. Hell, it even did better than Disney's film from that same year. Fast forward to now, and all of their past releases after Lego Movie have all done very well. Some not as much as others, but still miles ahead of their old films. And their upcoming film Smallfoot, while not likely to be a huge hit, will still probably continue the streak of success. Even Teen Titans Go to the Movies, while technically not under the Warner Animation Group brand, has proven to be a hit relative to its budget, doing a lot better than Warner's previous two films based on a TV show. It seems Warner has finally found a formula for them that works, and for that, I'm genuinely happy.
Just go ahead when you're ready.
Sorry, I wasn't listening. I've just been bat-mailing on my bad phone.
So now that we have all that history out of the way, it's time to look at the whole thing in retrospect. First of all, I think everyone can come to the conclusion that Warner Brothers have got to be run by some of the biggest fucking idiots out there.
This place is a mess.
Here was a company that, probably more than any during the 90s, could have really made a name for themselves. For starters, their feature animation department at the time was actually the second largest behind Disney in terms of animators, far below Disney's, but still a decent margin ahead of the rest. And speaking of other studios, during this era, every other animated studio in the US was trying to capitalize on the success of Disney. Of course, there were exceptions to this, but the vast majority of films were merely trying to copy the Disney formula. And while Warner would shoot themselves in the foot by doing this later, they were generally their own thing. Excluding Quest for Camelot, their films weren't musicals. They were comedies, they were dramas, they were crime thrillers. They had an attitude to them that's been a staple of their animation since the 40s. But what really made them stand out was their settings. They were set in contemporary times as opposed to centuries ago like most Disney films were at the time, which visually made them very unique. They easily could have capitalized on this image, but they missed out on that train as by the time the new millennium rolled around, other animated films were trying to catch up to their style. Even Disney would begin ditching what made them popular as Pixar and DreamWorks would start to outshine them. Less musicals were being made and more films in modern day, or at least somewhat contemporary settings, started happening. So by this point, what they were doing wasn't even unique anymore. During the 90s, all of Disney's films from their main lineup were rated G. Even something like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which easily should have gotten a PG, was stuck with a G in order to fall in line with their more family-friendly image. And other animated films at the time did the same. Not Warner Brothers though. Again, not counting Quest for Camelot, all their stuff got a PG like the big boys they were.
We've got balls!
And this was before DreamWorks made it cool too. But fast forward a few years into the 2000s and Disney started pumping out PG rated films too. So the novelty was lost by that point. All of this could have been prevented, but as you may or may not have noticed, there was a common theme throughout all their failures. Marketing. Literally the only reason almost everything that went wrong for them happened because of marketing. If they had better people handling it, imagine how different things could have turned out. Could Warner have filled the niche as Disney's biggest competitor in the 2000s? Would they have been more successful than DreamWorks? And how different would their modern animation lineup have been? Or would a film like Lego Movie even existed? Who's to say, but I definitely believe they could have at least been a force to be reckoned with. But back to their marketing, they only have themselves to blame. Maybe they thought the Warner Brothers name alone could get people to see their movies, so they figured they could save some money on marketing cost. That might have worked if they had actually built up a reputation in feature animation in the first place. But even then, Disney marketed the hell out of all their films despite being the top dog in animation at the time. And while their stuff wasn't always top notch, they did have some great films under their name. Mask of the Phantasm and Iron Giant were critical darlings. Cat's Own Dance became the first non-Disney film to win an Annie Award for Best Feature, and stuff like the Powerpuff Girls movie and Osmosis Jones were very unique movies that could have tapped into a far larger demographic that animated films were covering at the time, namely superhero and buddy cop films. And speaking of the Powerpuff Girls movie, that especially had the potential to do well considering how popular the show was at the time. It might not have done the numbers that the Rugrats movie did, but it certainly could have done a lot better than the Hey Arnold or Wild Thornberrys movie, neither of which were as popular as the Powerpuff Girls at the time. Okay, I'm getting too sidetracked by this, so let's move on. Even after the fall of their animation division, they would distribute other films that became hits, with one of them even winning an Oscar. And even before they started their feature animation division, they could have had a head start with the distribution of Fritz the Cat, but they ultimately decided to pass on that. Although in hindsight, this was probably for the best knowing Warner's history. What I'm getting at is that they always had a pretty decent catalog of films, but for some reason, they were too short-sighted to see it at the time. But even after all these years, they at least have their fans, and in the end, I guess that's what really matters. Better to be a flop and remembered for years to come, than to be a hit and forgotten about soon after.
Souls gonna die.
You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Can I go home now?